Once upon a time, in the heart of the medieval ages, there lay a village hidden in the folds of a gentle valley, where the earth swelled in soft humps and hollows, and the woods stood like ancient sentinels draped in ivy. This place was called Grellenford, not marked on any nobleman's map, nor celebrated in grand tales of chivalry or conquest. But to those who dwelled there, it was the whole world. A world shaped by the seasons, ruled by the rhythm of bells, and guarded not by steel, but by patience. Grellenford was no grand settlement. It bore no mighty walls, nor marketplace thronged with silks and spices. Its strength lay in its simplicity, a scatter of cottages thatched in straw, low and humble, clustered like resting sheep. Each house wore the same face, smoke curling from crooked chimneys, small windows shuttered tight against the wind, and doors carved by time and use, rather than by any craftsman's pride. Beneath those roofs, families lived as they always had, close to the land, close to the fire, and close to each other. It was the cusp of November, and already the breath of winter curled along the ridges, cold enough to stiffen fingers in the morning and turn puddles to mirrors of brittle ice. The sun still rose, but it lingered low, moving lazily across the pale sky before slipping beneath the hills far too early in the day. The light had changed. It no longer bathed the fields in golden warmth, but in something thinner, like cold honey poured over stone. The shadows grew longer with each passing afternoon, as though time itself was stretching toward sleep. The village felt it. Every soul in Grellenford sensed the shifting. It was in the way the crows cried longer in the morning, in how the sheep huddled closer, and in the taste of the air, earthy, brittle, and dry, as if the world were holding its breath. Among the many cottages stood the home of Edric the swineherd, his wife Matilda, and their son, young Osric, whose hands still bore more ink from curiosity than calluses from labor. Osric was of 12 winters, caught between the world of children and the world of men, where wonder had not yet yielded to weariness. He spent his mornings watching his father split wood, each strike of the axe a rhythm of necessity. In the afternoons, he followed the hens, read the shifting clouds, or lingered at the edge of the forest where the wild things moved silently. On this particular morning, the first frost had come. It lay in delicate lace across the grass, painted the edges of windows, and rimmed the well's stone mouth with white. It was a quiet thing, the frost, neither heralded by thunder nor wind, but its presence was as loud as any church bell. It marked the true beginning of the long cold. The villagers took note. Merrick the elder, who had seen more winters than there were stones in the chapel floor, declared it the earliest frost he could remember. "The foxes have dug deep," he muttered, half to himself, as he inspected the tracks outside his door. "And the moon's been thin for too long." His words carried, as such words always did, and soon the frost was no longer just a cold thing. It was a sign, a whisper of what was to come. Winter was not a stranger in Grellenford. It came every year, and with it, the familiar hardships. Days of gray silence, nights that wrapped tightly around the village like a cold fist, and meals that grew simpler as the cellar shelves thinned. But every winter was its own beast. Some came gently, others with hunger in their jaws. This one, the elders feared, would not be kind. And so the village moved, slowly at first, like a bear rousing from slumber. Wood was gathered in great stacks outside each home. Root vegetables were pulled from the soil, brushed of dirt, and stored in straw-lined bins beneath the floors. Apples, wizened and sweet, were hung from rafters in tight bundles. Jars of pickled cabbage, brined beans, and thickened goose fat lined every surface. It was not bounty. It was survival, measured in careful handfuls. Children were sent into the woods in pairs to gather kindling, their baskets swinging with pine cones and dry twigs. Women mended cloaks with stiff fingers and patched worn boots with scraps of hide. Men checked the roofs for leaks and rethatched the worst of the wear, while watching the sky with quiet eyes. And in the midst of it all, the fire became a sacred thing. Each home guarded its hearth, coaxing its embers to life each morning with careful breath and dried moss. Fire was more than warmth. It was a promise, a defense against the slow creep of death that prowled through the cold. When a fire went out, it was not simply a loss of heat, but a crack in the heart of the household. In the evenings, families huddled close. Meals were modest: barley porridge with a smear of salt pork, lentils with dried onions, And on the rarest of nights, a stew made rich with marrow bones. Osric would sit close to his mother's knee, listening to her speak of the winters of her own youth, when snow piled so high the world seemed made of silence, and the milk froze solid in the pail before it could be brought inside. He found comfort in those tales. They were not stories of knights or dragons, but of real things, of endurance, cleverness, and care. How his great-grandmother once warmed stones in the hearth and tucked them into the bedsheets. How neighbors shared fire when one family's hearth failed. How, when the snow fell hard and deep, the village became smaller, quieter, closer. The frost had arrived, yes, but with it came a kind of sacred stillness. It whispered, "Prepare." And so Grellenford listened. The frost had settled, and with it came the silent understanding that time was no longer theirs to squander. For the people of Grellenford, the gathering of firewood was not merely a task. It was a sacred ritual, one born of centuries of trial and error, of hardship handed down like an heirloom. Each family knew the weight of their winter. They did not measure it in days, but in bundles. A winter too short of kindling could spell sickness or worse, so every twig, every log, every splinter mattered. The village square, usually a place of brief greetings and bartering, had become a crossroads of labor. Men dragged sledges laden with timber, their shoulders taut with effort, breath steaming like smoke from the beasts that pulled beside them. The forest to the east, dark, deep, and whispered of in old tales, was now their lifeline. Edric, Osric's father, had taken to rising before first light. He would fill a sack with bread and salted strips of venison, sling his axe across his back, and set off with 2 other men, Torsten the weaver and Arnulf the leatherworker. Though their trades were not of the forest, their hands knew enough of toil to swing a blade through birch and pine. They moved as a trio, silent, deliberate, wary of wolves and the brittle ice beneath fallen leaves. Osric longed to go with them, but Matilda had gently kept him back. "There will be time for the forest, my son," she said, brushing frost from his cloak. "But for now, we need your hands here. The fire does not just burn with wood, it burns with readiness." And so the boy worked with the other children and elders, gathering what the men could not. Small branches snapped from hedges, bark from fallen stumps, pine cones heavy with resin. All were sorted, stacked, and tied with twine. Behind each home rose walls of fuel, bound tight against the wind, like fortresses of flame waiting to be kindled. Inside, the preparations took a different shape. Matilda and the other women cleaned the hearths until the stones gleamed. Old ashes were scattered in the gardens to nourish the soil beneath the snow. The chimneys were cleared with bundles of bramble, and thin sheets of leather were hung inside windows to shield against drafts. There was a curious invention known to all but never written of: the ash bed, a hollow beneath the sleeping platform filled with smoldering embers buried in ash. It provided a gentle, lasting warmth, especially when the night grew cruel and the outer walls sighed with frost. Only the eldest knew how to tend it properly, how to feed it slow-burning oak chips and whisper into it the prayers of a quiet night. Each night, before the village succumbed to slumber, the fires were rekindled anew. There was reverence in this act. The way kindling was laid just so, the spark struck, the flame nursed as one might cradle a newborn. Osric often watched his mother perform it, marveling at her calm, her steady hands, her whispered blessings. She would say, "Come fire, chase the dark, come warmth, shield the soul." And always, she would pause after the first flames caught, her face painted amber by the flickering light, and close her eyes. For in those moments the world beyond the door, cold, wild, unknowable, seemed held at bay by little more than faith and fire. Among the villagers, fire was more than a need. It was a symbol of life itself. On the first night of frost, they held a ritual called the Ember Promise. Each family brought a small coal from their hearth to the chapel, where Brother Aldwin placed them upon a communal brazier. There, the flames mingled and danced, and he spoke of unity. "One ember may die, but 100 may blaze. Let us keep each other lit." Afterward, each family took a portion of the sacred flame back home, a reminder that though winter might isolate them within thick walls and snowbound paths, they burned from the same spark. The warmth was not just heat, it was hope, passed hand to hand, hearth to hearth. In the days that followed, the first true snow came, not flurries, but great sheets of white that swept across the valley in quiet majesty. It blanketed the fields, covered the trees in sugar-white coats, and hushed every sound. Even the river slowed its voice, thickening beneath a film of ice. And still, the work continued. Osric watched from the threshold as his father returned one evening, boots caked in snow, beard rimed with frost but eyes bright. He carried not just wood, but a tale. They had found a felled oak, long dead but dry inside, a gift from the forest itself. They would cut and cure it in the barn, and it would warm them deep into January. Matilda smiled, weary but content, and laid another log upon the fire. It hissed, popped, then caught, and its light cast golden halos across the ceiling. Osric felt it then, deep in his bones. The safety of preparation, the strength of small victories, the ancient magic of warmth born from the labor of many hands. In Grellenford, winter did not arrive in a single night. It crept, it tested, it asked. And the village answered not with fear, but with flame. As winter tightened its grip around Grellenford, silence grew thicker with each passing day. The world outside the village stood still beneath its blanket of snow. Trees froze mid-gesture, their limbs outstretched like supplicants in prayer. The air became sharp, clean, and spare, as though even the wind held its breath. But within the homes of Grellenford, another silence had begun to settle, one not born of snow or stillness, but of hunger. This was not the loud, desperate hunger of the truly starved. It was quieter, a gnawing at the edges, an emptiness that curled around the ribs and made the smell of stew all the more tantalizing. It was the kind of hunger the villagers had known all their lives, a companion rather than a curse, something to be endured with patience, not fear. The food stores had been gathered with care, counted and recounted by hands that knew the weight of turnips and the worth of salt. In root cellars dug beneath the homes, vegetables slumbered in beds of straw. Barley and oats were stored in earthen jars sealed with wax and linen. Meat, cured with salt and smoked over greenwood, hung in rows above the hearths, absorbing the flavors of smoke and thyme. Yet even the best prepared cellar could not afford waste. Every portion had to last. Every morsel had a place in the calendar of survival. Matilda kept a ledger, not of ink and parchment, but of memory. She knew how many handfuls of grain would make a pot of porridge, how many lentils could stretch a broth, how much lard remained in the crock. Meals were smaller now. Breakfast was often just a heel of bread and a bit of cheese. Supper was a shared bowl, passed with quiet gratitude. And yet, there was no complaint. This moderation was not new. It was the rhythm of winter. The villagers spoke often of fasting wisdom, an old phrase that meant more than abstaining from food. It meant knowing what could be done without. It meant understanding the body's cycles, when to eat for strength, and when to let the hunger ride like a wave. There was a sacredness to it, a kind of bodily humility that matched the spirit of the season. Brother Aldwin often reminded them, during his weekly visits, that fasting brought one closer to the divine. The Lord's voice is clearest to the empty stomach, he would say, smiling gently as he declined the bread offered him. For in hunger we remember our place. On one such day, Osric sat at the table with his parents, his spoon scraping the bottom of a thin stew. It was little more than broth flavored with onion and a sliver of bone, yet his mother smiled as if it were a feast. He asked her, not with complaint but with curiosity, why the meals had grown so small. She looked at him softly and replied, "Because we eat with the winter, my love, and winter teaches us to be still, to be grateful." To help the children understand, some mothers told stories. Tales of the winter maiden, a spirit who watched over those who respected their stores, who punished greed with spoiled grain and rewarded frugality with hidden apples. Whether the children believed or not, they ate with reverence and never asked for more. There was also a tradition passed down each year, the Day of the Lean Bowl. On the coldest day in December, whenever it might fall, the village would intentionally eat nothing but a crust of bread and water. It was a symbolic fast, a way of reminding themselves of how thin the margin was between enough and none at all. That night, families gathered around their hearths with empty bellies but full hearts. They sang low songs, shared stories, and let the hunger pass through them like a wind. It was said that if you bore the Day of the Lean Bowl with grace, your pantry would hold through winter's worst. Among the stores, certain items were guarded as treasures: honey, which never spoiled and could soothe both throat and spirit. Garlic, hung in braids near the chimney, used both as flavor and medicine. Dried mushrooms, gathered in the damp autumn and stored in linen bags. And salt, always salt, measured in pinches, precious beyond gold. There were tricks, too. Bits of stale bread were soaked and fried in lard for richness. A single egg, rare in the freezing days, might be beaten into porridge to thicken it. Apples were stewed slowly, their sweetness stretched with cinnamon bark when it could be spared. And when food was truly scarce, they turned to what was called the monk's meal, a soup of boiling water, wild herbs, and nothing more. But the most important resource was community. When an elder's stores ran low, the neighbors brought from their own, quietly, without pride or pity. A loaf wrapped in cloth, a bowl left at the doorstep. No words were needed. For everyone knew, in Grellenford, no one ate well unless all ate something. This sense of shared survival was what made the hunger bearable. Osric once saw his father give the last of their barley to a widower whose cellar had flooded. That night, their own meal was scant, but his father's voice was calm. A full bowl tastes sweeter when another has eaten too. In this way, the hunger did not consume them. It passed through them like the frost, sharp, cold, but never lasting. And though their cheeks grew hollow and their clothes hung looser, their eyes still burned with the light of endurance. Winter had come, and with it, the silence of the earth, the stillness of breath, and the ache of empty bowls. But so too had come the old wisdom, the knowledge that in restraint there is power, and in shared hardship there is peace. In the heart of the long winter, when the wind keened through the forest like a sorrowful choir, and the frost clung to the inside of shutters, warmth was no longer just a comfort. It was a defense. And in Grellenford, clothing became a kind of armor. The villagers did not own furs from far lands, nor velvet-lined cloaks stitched with silver thread. Their garments were homespun, born from their own sheep, and stitched by hands that knew the rhythm of the needle as well as the rhythm of the hoe. But these simple garments held within them the genius of generations, a quiet, enduring wisdom about how to survive the bitterest months. Wool was the lifeblood of winter wear. From the first shearing in spring to the final stitch before frost, wool followed the rhythm of the seasons. It was washed, carded, spun into yarn by the hearth, and then woven tightly upon the loom. Matilda's loom stood beside the fire, its wooden frame softened by time, its threads taut as harp strings. Osric would watch her feet dance upon the petals, the shuttle flicking back and forth with a sound that matched the crackling of the fire. The resulting cloth was thick, coarse, and brown-gray like the backs of the sheep it came from. There was no room for elegance. Every stitch mattered. A mistake in weaving could let in cold, and in Grellenford, the cold was always watching. They dressed in layers, not fashion. First came the linen undershifts, thin but soft against the skin, often patched and resewn each year. Then came the wool, tunics, hose, wraps. Over that, cloaks, thick and heavy, secured with wooden toggles or bone pins. Some cloaks bore hoods sewn in, others were matched with separate cowls that could be drawn tight against the wind. A good cloak was a treasure. In many families, cloaks were passed down like blessings. Adric wore his father's, its edges frayed, but its weave still strong. Matilda's had belonged to her grandmother, and she kept it mended with such care it seemed new despite its age. Osric, now on the cusp of growing into his own man's cloak, had one sewn from scraps, each patch telling a story. Boots were made from leather, softened with tallow and lined with wool or straw. They were stitched by Arnulf the leather worker, who worked through the nights once the first frost arrived. His hands were cracked and stiff, but his skill kept the village's feet dry and safe. The children wore hand-me-downs tied with twine. When boots failed, feet were wrapped in cloth and straw, a trick learned from the old shepherds. Gloves and mittens were rare, but sleeves were long and could be tied over the hands. Women often wore fingerless mitts to continue spinning and sewing even in the cold. And scarves, long, rough things, were wrapped several times around the neck, up over the mouth, and sometimes even over the ears. Each family had their own traditions when it came to winter clothing. Some stitched small charms into the hems, pieces of ribbon, beads, or dried herbs for luck. Others whispered blessings over the cloaks before the first snow. May it shield more than skin, they would say. May it hold warmth and hope. But clothing was not just for the body. It was a form of care. When someone returned from the forest shivering and soaked, they were greeted not with words, but with blankets. When children cried from the cold, mothers wrapped them twice over, then held them close beside the fire until their cheeks blushed pink again. Osric remembered the day he received his winter cloak. Matilda had sewn it in secret, pieced from scraps of Edric's old tunic, the lining of a discarded blanket, and remnants from the cloth trade. On the morning of the first real snowfall, she laid it across his bed like a quiet gift. "It's not new," she said, smoothing the fabric with her fingers, "but it's stitched with care." Osric ran his fingers along the seams, seeing each color, each pattern from old garments he had known. It was like wearing the memory of many winters. When he slipped it on, the wool scratched, but he did not mind. It was his now, his armor, his warmth. The village shared this sense of reverence for winter garments. Clothes were not discarded when worn. They were reused, repurposed, turned inside out, or made into something smaller. A torn tunic could become mittens. A cloak too thin for warmth could be layered beneath another. Nothing was wasted. Every thread served. On the coldest days, when the sun failed to rise above the treetops and the snow squeaked underfoot, the villagers resembled creatures of cloth and wool. They moved slowly, wrapped head to toe, faces hidden behind scarves, eyes peering from beneath hoods. They looked like wraiths of the frost, but they moved with purpose, with strength born of habit. Children played in the snow only when well wrapped, and even then their laughter was breathless and quick, their hands quickly numbed. But even in play, they respected the cold. It was not their enemy, but a force to be respected. At night, cloaks were hung near the fire, boots placed carefully to dry. No garment was ever left damp overnight. It would freeze solid by morning, and nothing was taken for granted. Clothing was warmth. Warmth was life. And so the people of Grellenford wrapped themselves not in luxury, but in legacy. Each thread was a thread of survival, each patch a prayer, each layer a testament to quiet endurance. Winter wore many faces, but the villagers had one answer: wrap, bind, cover, endure. And as the wind howled beyond the doors and snow swept across the hills like ghostly waves, the village huddled beneath wool and memory and held on. There was a saying in Grellenford that no house was truly a home unless it held a living flame. And in winter, that flame, flickering within each hearth, was more than light, more than heat. It was the very heartbeat of the household. The hearth stood at the center of every cottage, built from stone and worn smooth by years of tending. Its smoke curled upward through crooked chimneys, out into the frozen air, where it drifted like a banner above each roof, signaling that life still stirred within. And around this fire, the rhythms of winter unfolded. From the first snow to the last thaw, the villagers guarded their hearts as one might guard a child. Each morning began with the stirring of embers. Kneeling in the gray hush before dawn, Matilda would draw back the ashes, searching for the faintest pulse of warmth left from the night before. If any ember still lived, if even a whisper of red glowed beneath the dust, she would coax it gently, feeding it curls of dry bark, breath, and patience, until a flame rose once more. To let the fire die was a serious matter. It meant not only discomfort, but danger. A cold home could breed illness, spoil stored food, and dampen spirits in a season when every comfort was precious. If a hearth ever did go cold, neighbors would bring burning coals wrapped in pottery shards or thick cloth, carried carefully like sacred relics. Fire was shared freely, without shame, for all understood its worth. Osric had learned early that the fire was not simply for cooking or warmth. It was the place where stories were told, where wool was spun, where tools were mended, and prayers whispered. Its light cast shadows against the walls, painting flickering patterns that danced with every sigh of wind. Each family had their own rituals of the flame. Some offered the first kindling of winter with a murmur of thanks to St. Bridget, protector of the hearth and home. Others carved runes into firewood, symbols of luck and health. And many, like Matilda, simply knelt in quiet reverence each morning, offering breath and touch with care. By day, the fire served practical needs. A cauldron hung over the coals, always with something simmering, be it a stew, a tisane of herbs, or a mash for the pigs. The heat dried damp clothing and warmed water for washing. Children sat nearby, rubbing their hands or toasting slices of rye on sticks. In the dim winter light, the hearth was the sun around which all turned. But it was in the evenings that the fire became truly sacred. As dusk fell and the outside world turned to ink and frost, families gathered close. The shutters were drawn, the wind muffled, and the hearth grew bright with orange and gold. Faces flushed in its glow. Laughter, though rare in those hard months, came easier beside the flame. Osric would sit cross-legged with his parents, his legs tucked under a woolen blanket, listening to tales as old as the village itself. His favorite was the one about the fire that never died, a single coal that burned for 100 years beneath a saint's cottage, keeping her warm through wars and storms and famine. Matilda always ended the story with the same soft smile. The fire stays, if the heart stays. There were practical arts, too. Matilda taught Osric the ways of fire-keeping, how to bank the coals at night beneath ash to preserve their heat, how to choose which woods burned long and clean, which sparked too fiercely, and which ones smelled sweet when lit. Hazel for warmth, applewood for scent, oak for endurance. Never greenwood, never driftwood, and never pine unless in desperate need, for its smoke was thick and unforgiving. Some homes kept ember stones, rounded rocks heated in the coals and wrapped in cloth to warm beds or stiff limbs. Others built cinder cradles, small clay bowls of hot ash carried to those too ill to leave their beds. The fire gave in many forms, each shaped by the needs of the home. Edric, though seldom a man of many words, had his own way of honoring the flame. Every 7th night, after supper, he would add a piece of wood from the oldest part of their stack, a log set aside from the first day of harvest. It was said to carry the memory of summer sun, and as it burned, he would sit quietly, eyes closed, hands folded. He never explained why, but Osric sensed it was a ritual older than even his father could name. One bitter night, the wind howled so fiercely that the shutters rattled and the roof beams groaned. The fire leapt and hissed, reacting to each gust. Matilda rose and added extra wood, while Osric fetched their thickest blanket. They sat together, huddled close, the fire casting bold shadows. Outside, the world raged. Inside, they were safe. In that moment, Osric understood. The hearth was not just warmth, it was defiance. It was life drawn against the edge of winter's reach. It was memory, protection, and promise, all bound in flame. And beyond the practical and sacred, the fire held a strange, ancient magic, one unspoken but deeply felt. Even the animals drew near. Cats curled on warm stones. Dogs laid across the threshold. The old would nap beside it, and newborns were introduced to it in their first days. It was the first thing lit in a new home, and the last thing extinguished when a loved one passed. In spring, when the snow melted and the world stirred again, the hearth would lose its primacy. The doors would open, the sun would warm the floors once more. But until then, in the depth of winter's hold, it was the beating heart of every home. And in Grellenford, every heart still burned. When the snow began to fall in earnest, thick, constant, and unyielding, the world around Grellenford shifted. It was not the sudden burst of a storm, but a steady curtain of white that descended over days and days, until the familiar hills vanished beneath smooth mounds and the trees seemed buried in silence. It was as if the entire world had exhaled, and the exhale had turned to snow. Paths disappeared, fences were swallowed. The river, once quick and laughing, slowed into glass and finally ceased altogether, locked beneath a crust of ice. The birds had long since flown, and even the wind held a hush, muffled by the layers of snow that wrapped the village like a woolen shawl. Inside each cottage, time began to slow. Gone were the long walks to the fields, the hauling of timber from the forest, the errands to the edge of the woods. Movement now was measured and deliberate, a crossing from one end of the room to the other, a trip to the lean-to to fetch more wood, or to the barn, if one dared, to tend to the animals in a world turned white. For most, the farthest journey of the day was to the well, where water was drawn with stiff hands and the rope creaked like an old song in the cold air. Even this simple task became a matter of planning. Boots wrapped, cloaks layered, mittens donned. Snow had to be shoveled aside, paths trampled firm underfoot, and lids cracked open where frost had sealed them. But beyond these necessities, the villagers embraced the stillness. The world had slowed, and so did they. Mornings were quiet, the hearths were stirred, The bread warmed, the tea poured from clay pots wrapped in wool. Conversation was soft, almost reverent. It felt wrong to speak too loudly, to break the peace the snow had brought. Even the children, so often lively in the warmth of other seasons, played in whispers, their laughter brief and bright like sparrows flitting through the bare trees. In these days, stillness became a kind of rhythm. There was weaving to be done, of course, and mending and quiet carving. The men whittled spoons and handles, repaired broken tools, shaped wooden toys for children or new buttons for cloaks. The women embroidered patches onto old cloth, spun wool into thread, and stirred pots that simmered for hours. No task was urgent, but each held importance. Osric came to understand that winter was a season not of doing, but of being. It was a time when life turned inward, when the world outside became inhospitable and all energy retreated to the hearth, to memory, and to the slow unfolding of thought. He spent his afternoons reading the old book Brother Aldwin had loaned him before the snow came, parchment bound in leather, its pages thick with stories of saints and kings, of miracles and quiet acts of faith. He traced the letters with his finger, mouthing the words as the fire warmed his back, and the world remained white and still outside the window. Occasionally, a snowstorm would sweep through, the wind rising with sudden ferocity, and the snow would batter against the shutters like waves against a ship's hull. On those nights, the family drew closer still. Matilda would tell tales of her girlhood winters, of blizzards so fierce they buried the doors, and of the spring mornings when the snow receded like a tide, revealing life beneath. She spoke of the snow mothers, ghostly women said to wander the hills during the deepest snow, weeping not out of sorrow, but in longing for the spring. Osric listened with wide eyes, imagining white figures drifting between the trees, blessing those who endured the cold with gentler dreams. And indeed, dreams seemed more vivid during those long nights. Perhaps it was the hush that settled over everything, or the way the fire cast moving shadows upon the beams. Perhaps it was the silence outside that made every flicker of imagination echo louder within. But in Grellenford, winter was not merely endured, it was felt deeply. Though movement outside was scarce, necessity still called the brave. Brother Aldwin made his rounds even when the snow lay waist deep. Wrapped in a cloak lined with sheepskin, he carried his satchel of dried herbs and ointments, his staff steadying him as he waded from door to door. No one expected him, but all welcomed him. His arrival meant a prayer, a smile, a tincture for aching joints, or a salve for cracked skin. It meant the outside world had not disappeared, merely grown quieter. Others, too, ventured briefly into the white. Arnulf went daily to check on the livestock, stamping down new snow with each visit. Torstan the weaver carried thread to the widow Hildy when she fell ill and could no longer spin her own. Even Osric braved the cold once to dig out a buried henhouse, his cheeks pink with effort, his breath rising like steam. These small acts of motion became the village's quiet song, the shuffle of boots on snow, the creak of frozen wood, the murmur of voices beneath scarves, all part of a melody only winter could compose. And when the sun did appear, briefly coldly, it turned the snow to crystal, lighting the world with a brilliance too sharp for the eye. The rooftops gleamed, the trees sparkled, and the fields looked as if they'd been carved from glass. It was beautiful in a way summer never could be. Harsh, yes, but honest. The world made plain and perfect. In those moments, even the stillest hearts stirred. The villagers would stand outside, if only for a moment, their faces turned skyward, the light reflected in their eyes. And then they would return inside, boots stamping, cloaks shaken, cheeks alight. Winter, with all its weight and hush, had not taken from them. It had given them pause. It had given them time to rest, time to reflect, time to simply be. In the quiet of a Grellenford winter, when even the sun seemed reluctant to rise, there was one place that remained gently alive with breath and movement: the barns. They stood not far from the cottages, built low and sturdy with timber frames packed tight with straw and clay. Their roofs bowed under the weight of snow, but within they were wombs of warmth, filled with the slow rustle of creatures at rest. The animals were not mere possessions in this time of year. They were companions in survival. Osric always felt something sacred upon stepping into the barn. The shift in temperature was immediate, a balm against the frost. The warmth did not come from any fire, but from bodies, from breath, from the quiet furnace of life shared between man and beast. The air was thick with the smells of hay, fur, dung, and feed, but also of something more ancient, the scent of reliance. The pigs grunted softly in their pen, their bodies pressed close, their eyes half-lidded with sleep. The cows, ever patient, chewed their cud slowly, their eyes reflecting the glow of the lantern Osric carried. Chickens murmured from their perches, rustling their feathers in dreams. Even the old mule, worn from many seasons, gave a slow nod of acknowledgement when the boy passed. Each animal had a place. Each was known by name or habit. Matilda could tell which hen laid which egg. Edric knew the rhythm of each pig's snore. Even the sheep had their quirks, and their wool had kept the family warm through every winter memory Osric possessed. Feeding the animals was not just a chore, it was an act of gratitude. Grain was measured carefully, hay fluffed and turned, water kept from freezing with hot stones dropped into troughs. And when wood was scarce, it was the animals who gave back, heat rising from their bodies, a presence that softened the cold in more ways than one. Some families, especially those with newborns or elders, would even bring goats into the cottage for a night or two, letting them sleep near the fire. It was not uncommon to see a sheep nestled beside a bed, wrapped in old linens, or a calf dozing in a corner, its nose tucked beneath its flank. There was no shame in this, only understanding. In the deep months, life clung to life. Warmth, in whatever form it came, was shared. Osric particularly loved the mornings in the barn. The world outside would be dark and brittle, but inside, the animals greeted him with quiet expectation. He moved through them like a ritual, checking hooves, patting flanks, whispering greetings. He had a special bond with one of the sheep, a speckled ewe named Merla, who would nuzzle his side and follow him from one end of the barn to the other. One morning, after a night of heavy snowfall, Osric found a bird curled in the hay, barely alive, feathers iced over. He gathered it gently, warmed it in his hands by the lantern's light, and nestled it in a corner beside the goats. It did not move much, but it lived. For days, he fed it crumbs and watched as its wings began to flutter once more. When it finally flew off into the low winter sky, he felt a joy unlike any other, a proof that life, even in the smallest measure, could be saved. The barn was also a place of storytelling. On stormy nights, Edric would sometimes bring Osric there after supper. They would sit on overturned buckets while the animals slept around them, the boy leaning against his father's side, listening to tales of winters past, of cattle lost in drifts, of wolves driven off by torchlight, of the one-eyed rooster that crowed through an entire blizzard and survived. These stories, warm with humor and memory, tied Osric not only to his family, but to the very rhythm of the land. He saw in the animals more than labor or food. He saw kinship. And indeed, the villagers respected their beasts deeply. There were no idle hands and no idle creatures either. In spring and summer, the animals gave labor, milk, wool, and meat. But in winter, they gave something quieter: companionship. Old Merrick, the village woodcutter, was known to speak to his oxen as if they were old soldiers, comrades from another life. Widow Hildy kept a rooster that perched by her window every morning, warming itself on the sill and clucking until she stirred. Even Brother Aldwin kept a black goat named Ephraim, who followed him like a shadow and was known to nod gravely whenever scripture was read aloud. There were songs, too, simple ones passed down through generations. Matilda would hum one when milking. Warm in the hay, safe from the storm, sleep now, my gentle four-legged form. Osric once asked her why she sang, and she replied, "Because they listen, and sometimes I think they remember." In the cruelest weeks, when snow piled against the door and cold crept through the walls, the knowledge that the animals were warm and well-fed gave the villagers peace. For to care for another, even in hardship, was to resist the bitter pull of despair. And when the snow finally began to recede, when the first thaw dripped from the eaves and the air smelled faintly of soil again, it was the animals who stirred first, sniffing, shuffling, eager. Their restlessness became a herald of spring. But until then, in those long white months, they were steady. Their warmth, their breath, their simple presence were gifts. In the barn, surrounded by the gentle sounds of beasts sleeping, Osric often forgot the cold entirely. There, in the straw-sweet air, life felt slower, kinder, and unbroken. The cold could howl and the snow could fall, but within those wooden walls, warmth remained. As winter deepened and the snow piled higher than the fences, the people of Grellenford turned ever more inward. The cold was no longer an event. It was a presence, constant and unmoving, like a quiet guest seated in every room. Yet even within that stillness, the villagers found cause to gather. And in the very heart of the coldest weeks, when the nights grew longest, they lit their candles and met in warmth and song. These were the midwinter gatherings. There was no fixed day, no summons by bell or banner. The gatherings happened when the snow was deep enough, the firewood stacked high enough, and the hearts of the people hungered for one another. Sometimes they met in the chapel, where the cold stone walls were softened with woven rugs and lanterns. Other times it was in the largest of cottages, with benches pulled close, stew pots simmering, and windows shuttered tight. Brother Aldwin was often the first to speak of it, raising the thought as he made his rounds. "The night is long," he'd murmur with a glint in his eye, "but we've stories still unshared." That was all it took. By week's end, the village knew there would be a gathering. It began with light. Lanterns were lit with beeswax candles, their honey-colored glow casting golden halos on the walls. Children carried them from house to house, small flames swaying in the wind like stars walking through snow. The villagers arrived wrapped in cloaks and wool, boots dusted in frost, laughter rising in little puffs of steam. They entered into warmth, into closeness, into joy born not of wealth, but of presence. There was no formal ceremony. The gatherings were shaped by who came and what they brought. Old Merrick often arrived with his fiddle, worn smooth at the neck and missing a peg, but still singing sweet and true. He would sit by the hearth and begin to play. Long, winding melodies that seemed to hold the memory of pine trees and frozen rivers. Children danced in small, shuffled steps, hands clasped, cheeks pink. The elders tapped feet, nodded heads, some mouthing words to tunes older than the village itself. Matilda once brought a braided bread she had saved for just such a night, flavored with dried fruit and honey, browned at the edges, torn by hand and passed from palm to palm. Edric brought a flask of spiced cider, warmed by the fire, and shared in modest sips from a tin cup. No one brought much. No one needed to. The gift was in the gathering. There were stories, of course. Always stories. Some were true, or close enough. Others bore the fingerprints of legend. Tales of forest spirits, of shepherds who outwitted wolves, of children who followed lanterns through snow and returned with spring in their pockets. One favorite was the story of the lantern lamb, a white sheep born midwinter with a star-shaped patch upon its forehead. It wandered from barn to barn, bringing warmth wherever it lay, and disappeared when the thaw came. Children clung to this tale, and some even claimed to have seen its tracks in the snow. Osric, though skeptical, once swore he heard a bleat on a windless night. And in the hush between stories, there were songs. They were not grand ballads, but small, lulling tunes sung in rounds or low chorus. Songs of hearthlight, of the turning wheel of seasons, of the moon watching over slumbering earth. Sometimes, someone would hum a lullaby, and others would join, until the whole room was bathed in soft melody. One such song, always sung in the middle of the evening, was simply called "Still We Burn." Its verses were few, its chorus steady. Though the cold may bind the door, still we burn, still we burn. Though the wind may cry once more, still we burn, still we burn. It was not a cry of defiance, but of quiet assurance. A reminder that the cold could surround them, press upon every shutter and eave, but inside, among friends and firelight, there was still warmth, still laughter, still light. Children curled against their mothers' sides, dogs snored beneath benches. The fire snapped and shifted. Shadows danced on beams and walls, moving as if to the music. For a few precious hours, winter did not seem so vast. Osric loved these gatherings more than any feast. They required no silver, no grand halls, only a room, a hearth, a willingness to be near one another. He often sat beside the fire with his legs drawn up, watching the faces of his neighbors lit by flame. In those faces, he saw not fear of winter, but familiarity, not resignation, but quiet courage. As the night deepened, the gathering would taper into silence. One by one, people would rise, offer thanks, and wrap themselves again in cloaks. The snow outside would have softened underfoot, and the path home, though cold, would feel gentler. Sometimes, A few would linger behind to help sweep ash, fold wool blankets, or refill lanterns. And always, someone would carry an ember home in a fire-safe pot, just in case their own hearth had faltered. The midwinter gathering did not end with applause or farewell. It ended with the last person slipping out the door, snow catching in their hair, and the warm hush of a place well sat, well sung, and well remembered. Back in their homes, the villagers would sleep a little deeper, dream a little sweeter, their hearts buoyed by the memory of light shared in darkness. For in Grellenford, even in the harshest season, warmth was never just about fire. It was about faces. It was about voices. It was about not being alone. Winter spared none its touch. Even those who wrapped themselves well, who sat close to the hearth and drank warm broth each night, eventually felt the cold's reach. A cough would echo in the corner of a room. A child's nose would run for days. Joints stiffened, throats burned, and fevers came like slow-rising fog. But in Grellenford, illness was not met with fear. It was met with knowledge. The villagers had inherited a deep and quiet wisdom, passed from grandmother to daughter, from wandering monk to listening child. It was not written in books, but kept in memory and practice, rooted in the soil as surely as any turnip or yarrow plant. In winter, when the body weakened, this wisdom became the village's true shield. Brother Aldwin, though a man of God, was also a man of herbs. His small apothecary, housed within the rear of the chapel, was lined with dried bundles, sage, horehound, lavender, mint, thyme, and the ever-reliable willow bark. Jars held beeswax, lard, ground roots, and powders that smelled of old wood and bitter earth. Hanging above his work table was a faded parchment showing the humors of the body, a reminder that balance, not excess, was the root of health. But the good brother was not alone in tending to the sick. Every village had its wise woman, and Grellenford's was Mabe, a widow of many years with hands like tree bark and eyes like moss. She had lived through 37 winters and could tell a fever's origin from the taste of a patient's breath. Her cottage stood near the stream, its roof sagging, but its shelves full, lined with stones warmed for aching bellies, tinctures for coughs, and balms that turned cracked skin soft again. When the cold took hold, the people sought her gently. They brought her eggs, bits of wool, sometimes just a candle stub. She asked for little, but gave much. One common remedy was a tea brewed from elderflower, honey, and dried mint, a tonic for chills and congestion. For fevers, she used willow bark steeped in water left overnight beside the hearth. For sore joints, she rubbed a mixture of goose fat and rosemary into the skin, then wrapped it in warmed cloth. She even kept a jar of garlic soaked in cider to be taken by the spoonful. Its taste was hated, but its power respected. Children, especially, were watched carefully. Their small bodies bore the cold with less resilience, and the nights could bring sudden sweats or shivering. Mothers sat with them, wiping brows with damp linen, whispering lullabies between sips of herb broth. A small pouch of dried rue and chamomile was sometimes tied to the bedpost, not for science, but for comfort. Osric had fallen ill one winter past, his breath wheezing, his chest rattling like a caged bell. Matilda had held him upright night after night, spooning in broth and pressing hot stones to his back. Brother Aldwin came daily with a tisane of coltsfoot and thyme. Mabe brought a bundle of dried mullein, which she burned beside the bed to clear the air. He recovered, but slowly. And even now he remembered the taste of honey-warmed cider, the scratch of linen on fevered skin, and the way his mother never once left his side. There was a deep kindness in the tending of the sick during winter. It was not rushed. It was not sterile. It was full of touch, voice, scent, and warmth. No one suffered alone. Neighbors checked in often, even if just to bring a cloth-wrapped potato or a thimble of mead. Every gift, no matter how small, carried healing. Prevention, too, was a ritual. Garlic was hung near the door. Ashes from the first Yule fire were scattered at thresholds to keep bad air from crossing. A sprig of juniper was placed in the chimney to sweeten the smoke and strengthen the lungs. And perhaps most crucial of all was warmth. A chilled body could not heal. Blankets were layered deep, beds moved closer to the hearth, and hands rubbed constantly, each movement a prayer in motion. When a child was ill, the family often slept together, drawing close in a nest of limbs and wool, breath warming breath. There were superstitions as well. Some swore by sleeping with a smooth stone from the river beneath the pillow. Others believed in whispering one's illness into a handful of salt and tossing it into the fire. These acts were part of the healing, too. Not for the body, perhaps, but for the heart. Healing in Grellenford was not only about curing, it was about comforting. One evening, when a fever had taken young Ansel, the miller's son, the villagers gathered quietly. Mabe stayed through the night, stirring a thick salve. Brother Aldwin read softly from a psalter, and the neighbors sat in silence. No words were needed, just the presence, just the warmth. Ansel recovered, and days later his mother brought a carved spoon to Mabe, tied with twine and sprigs of dried thyme. For the hands that stirred, she said, and the heart that stayed. So it was, each winter, illness came as sure as snow, but so too came care in 100 small acts, a shared bowl, a tended fire, a whispered blessing, a touch upon the brow. For the people of Grellenford did not fear sickness. They respected it, and they answered it, with herbs, with hands, and with the simple, enduring belief that no one should suffer alone. In the depth of cold, healing was not a miracle. It was a way of life. As the days reached their shortest, and the darkness seemed to settle deep into the marrow of every hour, the people of Grellenford turned their thoughts to the oldest of winter traditions, the Yule flame. It was a time unlike any other, whispered of in reverent tones by the old and eagerly anticipated by the young. Not for its feasts, for there was little to spare, and not for its gifts, for such luxuries were beyond their reach. Rather, it was for the flame itself, a sacred fire kindled at the very heart of the year's longest night, meant to chase back the shadows and call forth the promise of light. Yule marked the turning. It did not end winter, but it began the hope of spring. Preparations began days before, quiet and deliberate. Adric and 2 other men journeyed to the edge of the forest, where a felled oak had lain since autumn. Its wood was seasoned, split, and set aside for this moment alone. The largest log, called the Yule heart, was selected with care. It bore a knot in its center and rings dark with age. It would burn long and slow. Matilda began gathering candles. Some were old stubs, others freshly dipped in beeswax that Osric had helped roll with chilled fingers. Each would be lit during the vigil and placed in windows so that the village glowed like a cluster of stars in a sea of white. On the evening of Yule, the entire village made its way to the chapel. The snow was deep, but no one stayed behind. They walked in silence, carrying small lanterns, each flame flickering like a heartbeat. It was said that if a light went out along the way, another would be offered without question. No soul was to enter the vigil in darkness. Inside the chapel, the air was heavy with warmth and wax and the mingled scent of rosemary and pine. Boughs had been laid across the beams, tied with ribbons of cloth and sprigs of dried berries. The altar was bare, save for the iron brazier in its center, cold, waiting, ready. Brother Aldwin stood beside it, his voice quiet but sure. "This night," he began, "we gather not in strength but in stillness, not in triumph but in trust. The sun is far but it returns. The cold is deep but it passes, and so we light the Yule flame, not for fire alone but for the light within us all." With that, the brazier was lit. A single ember, carried from the chapel's hearth, was placed upon the kindling. The villagers leaned in, breathless. The flame caught, slowly at first, then rising in a warm golden bloom. It touched the pine boughs with dancing shadows. It made the children's eyes shine. It softened the furrowed brows of the weary. As the flame grew, the candles were passed around, lit one by one from the central fire. Each person, from the youngest to the oldest, carried their candle to the windowsill, to the step, to the altar rail. Grellenford's chapel became a sea of flame, not bright but steady, as though the stars themselves had descended. Songs followed, low and ancient with melodies that curled like smoke. Some were hymns, others lullabies. One, called The Returning, was sung each year by Mabe, her voice cracked with age but strong in spirit. When the world is white with sorrow, and the sky holds fast the sun, we kindle hope in darkness, a flame that guides us on. Osric sang too, though softly. He held his candle close, watching the way the wax dripped down the sides like frozen tears. In the flicker of light, he saw faces transformed. Neighbors, friends, even the surliest old shepherd now bathed in something holy. Later in the night, the Yule heart log was brought into the chapel and laid upon the brazier. Its size made the fire leap high, and its scent, rich and deep, filled the room. It would burn through the night and into the morning. Each family brought a small piece of wood from their own hearth to place alongside it, a symbol of unity, of shared warmth. There were no sermons after that. No need. The fire spoke for all. People sat in circles on the floor, wrapped in blankets, sharing dried apples, bits of bread, sips of warmed wine. Children leaned against mothers, men shared quiet nods, and the fire crackled like a heartbeat steadying the night. Osric drifted in and out of sleep, head resting on Matilda's shoulder. He dreamed of fields not yet sown, of lambs not yet born, of sun-dappled streams and green hills. He dreamed of warmth not yet felt, but surely coming. When the dawn finally came, soft and gray as wool, the villagers emerged from the chapel one by one. The fire still glowed behind them, and the snow around the door shimmered with the light of a new day. They did not shout, did not cheer. They simply walked home with slower steps and gentler hearts. The Yule flame remained, its embers carried back to relight hearths, to fill homes again with sacred warmth. Some families marked their doorways with soot from the Yule heart, believing it would guard them until spring. Others buried a sliver of the burned log in their gardens, a gift to the earth that would one day bloom. But all remembered. All carried the light, both within and without. In Grellenford, Yule was not a celebration of plenty, but of promise. A quiet defiance of the cold, a shared breath in the longest night, and as winter held on still, the people now held something more. A flame once shared never truly fades. When the snow grew too thick to travel, and the world outside offered only silence. The people of Grellenford turned inward, not only into their homes, but into their hands. Winter, for all its harshness, was also a season of making. The fields slept, the trees stood bare, and the animals lay quietly in their stalls. But in the cottages, barns, and low-beamed workshops, the sounds of hammers, blades, and carving tools rang softly against the hush. This was the time for tools, for repairs, for slow creation. It was the season of ice and iron. At the northern edge of the village, half buried in snow, stood the blacksmith's forge, a squat stone building with smoke that curled thick and warm into the gray sky. Within, the air remained alive. Though the wind howled past the shuttered windows, it could not enter. The fire within burned high and constant, fed with precious charcoal made in autumn kilns. Here worked Halric, the smith, a broad man with arms like beams and eyes that burned bright as his anvil. In summer, he shod horses and mended plows. In winter, his work turned inward. He reforged axes, dulled by months of woodcutting. He shaped new hinges for doors swelled and split by frost. He repaired cooking hooks, riveted chains, and shaped iron nails with a rhythm as steady as snowfall. His hammering was a music of its own. Osric loved to watch, standing at the threshold, with his breath puffing in clouds. The hiss of red-hot metal meeting snow-cooled water, the clang of the hammer upon the anvil, and the dance of orange sparks filled the air with purpose. Halric seldom spoke, but when he did, it was with patience. He explained the metal's moods, how it softened like wax at the right heat, how it sang under a good strike. Each piece was born with care, not rushed, not wasted. For in winter there was no room for error. A broken latch might mean a door that would not close. A cracked pot handle could spill the only stew of the week. Halric's work held the village together in ways that often went unseen, but never unfelt. Elsewhere in the village, the woodworkers stirred. Torstan, the weaver by trade, doubled as a carver in the still months. His tools were small and precise, chisels and knives honed sharp enough to shave a feather. In the corner of his cottage, beneath a window fogged with breath and frost, he carved toys from yew and oak, tiny horses, spinning tops, and puzzle boxes. His gifts were not for coin, but for joy. Children received them after chores or when illness abated. Even the sternest mothers could not frown when a child unwrapped a wooden fox or a miniature sleigh carved with stars. But Torstan also carved handles for knives, bowls for porridge, spoons for stirrings, and combs for tangled hair. These were passed from hand to hand, marked not with initials, but with the memory of who gave them. A well-carved spoon outlasted many winters and told a story with every scratch. Some men worked leather. Arnulf stitched boots anew, repaired bridles, and sewed satchels strong enough to bear firewood through snow. He taught Osric how to soften frozen hide by soaking it in warm water with crushed birch bark. and how to press the seams closed with a stone warmed at the hearth. Women, too, kept the rhythm of craft. Matilda and her neighbors spun wool into thread so fine it slid through the needle's eye like mist. They dyed it with leftover onion skins, walnut husks, and dried berries, turning winter's gray into threads of russet, plum, and dull gold. From these, they embroidered stories into cloth, stars, sheep, little flowers that would not bloom for months. Even the elders who could no longer swing tools or thread needles found ways to make. They told stories, taught patterns, passed on secrets. Old Geetha, nearly blind, showed Osric how to weave a net of willow twigs that could catch snow from melting. "You catch light in it," she said, tapping his hand. "Snow is just light in another shape." No one sat idle. Winter was too long for that. Even broken things were not discarded. Every cracked cup, every bent fork, every worn-out bucket was given a second life. Leather straps bound the split wood of chairs. Wool scraps filled holes in coats. A wagon wheel missing half its rim became a coat rack. What could not be fixed was repurposed. What could not be repurposed was burned. This making was more than necessity. It was balm. When the cold bit through even the thickest cloak, when the wind groaned like a lost soul across the rooftops, it was the act of creation that kept despair at bay. A man shaping a blade, a woman darning a sock, a child whittling a flute, they were not merely passing time. They were asserting life, motion, hope. Each object made or mended was a testament. We are still here. Osric began to carve that winter. With Torstan's guidance and Halric's old chisel, he shaped a small bird from pine. It was crude, lopsided, but when he placed it on the mantel, Matilda smiled as if it were made of silver. That night, as the wind howled and the snow rose past the sill, the little bird sat by the fire, casting a soft shadow upon the wall. And in its form, simple, imperfect, but warm with meaning, was the spirit of the village. For in Grellenford, winter did not silence hands. It invited them to speak. Beyond the fields of Grellenford, past the frozen meadows and fences burdened with snow, lay the forest, ancient, patient, and watching. It was not a place of fear, but of deep regard. Even in the brightest days of summer, the villagers stepped beneath its canopy with reverence. And in winter, when the trees stood still as statues and the light could not penetrate their boughs, the forest became something more, a boundary, a guardian, and in the quietest moments, a mystery. The villagers called it the Edge, not because it bordered the village, but because it seemed to border the known world. When the snow came, the edge transformed. Paths vanished beneath drifts. Branches hung heavy with frost, their limbs creaking like timbers of a forgotten ship. The trees, oak, ash, beech, and pine, leaned together as though whispering secrets, their trunks lined with lichen and age. No bird sang within, no squirrels stirred. And yet, there was always the sense of presence. The children were taught early, do not wander too deep, especially after the sun begins its descent. The woods were not evil, but they were old. Older than the chapel, older than the road, perhaps even older than the river that curled through the land like a silver ribbon of memory. Many tales surrounded the edge, passed down from grandmother to child in winters past. These were not stories of monsters, but of watchers, beings who moved between trees when no one looked, who shaped snow into strange patterns, who marked the bark with signs no blade had made. Some villagers called them the silent folk, others the gray kin. They were said to wear no clothes, carry no tools, speak no tongue. Yet they watched always from a distance, never drawing near unless invited, never intruding unless called. During the darkest nights of winter, when the sky was moonless and the wind moved not at all, Osric would stand by the edge of the barn and gaze toward the tree line. It was only 50 paces away, yet it felt like another realm entirely. He could feel the forest watching, not with menace, but with curiosity. Matilda once told him, while mending a mitten by the fire, "The forest remembers things we have forgotten. It's not unfriendly, but it will not be tamed." He asked her if the watchers were real, and she nodded once. Real enough. Whether they wear cloaks or are just wind in the trees, I cannot say. But I know this. When we are kind to the woods are kind to us. There were rituals the villagers kept without fully understanding. A sliver of bread tossed toward the forest line during a full moon. A bow made upon entering the tree line for kindling. Children were taught to say thank you when taking firewood or berries. These were not rules, but habits, and no one dared break them. On the first full moon after Yule, the villagers observed a tradition called the Lantern Walk. At twilight, each household lit a small lantern, and a single volunteer, always an elder, always willing, would carry them to the edge of the forest and place them in a crescent-shaped arc facing the trees. The light was not meant to summon, it was meant to honor. Brother Aldwin, though a man of faith, never interfered. Even the saints respect the old woods, he once said with a smile, and light is never wasted in darkness. On the night of one such walk, Osric asked to come along. Edric hesitated, then nodded. The boy wrapped himself in 2 cloaks, tucked his lantern into the crook of his arm, and followed the others through knee-high snow. The moon was high, casting silver paths upon the fields. The air was so still he could hear the snowflakes land. When they reached the edge, no one spoke. The forest stood before them, not threatening, but vast. Their lanterns were placed carefully in the snow, flickering like a broken necklace of stars. The trees did not move. The night held its breath. Then, from deep within the woods came a sound. It was not a voice, nor a beast's cry. It was a note, a low, wind-like hum that rose and fell like a sigh through the trunks. It lasted only a moment, but every villager heard it. They did not speak of it on the walk home. They did not need to. Back in the cottage, Osric sat by the hearth, wide-eyed. Matilda tucked a blanket around him and said only, "The woods answered." Not all believed in watchers. Some thought the tales were simply old warnings against getting lost. Others, like Halric the smith, said the forest was full of wind and nothing more. But even Halric walked quietly when near the trees. One winter, when a child went missing, just for a night, lost in the snow, the villagers lit lanterns and placed them at the edge. The next morning, the boy was found asleep beneath a pine tree, unharmed, wrapped in a blanket not his own. To this day, no one knows who left it. There are no roads into the edge in winter. No sled tracks, no footprints return from deep within. Yet every now and then, a fresh bundle of pine cones appears near the path. Or a branch, woven with moss and winterberries, lies beside a fence. Gifts, some say. Reminders, others whisper. In Grellenford, the forest is not just trees. It is memory. It is silence. It is something just beyond knowing. And in winter, when the world narrows to what is warm and near, the edge remains, vast, still, and ancient, as if waiting for spring like the rest of them. But until then, it watches, and is watched in return. In the heart of winter, when the snow pressed heavy upon the roofs, and even the rivers moved in silence beneath their icy shells, faith became more than ritual. It became breath. The people of Grellenford had always been a quiet folk, their beliefs stitched into their lives like the lining of a cloak. Unseen, but always present. The chapel, small and timber-framed, stood at the center of the village, not in grandeur, but in stillness. Its stone bell tower rose above the drifted snow like a shepherd's crook, guiding the eye upward when all else bowed beneath the weight of the season. Brother Aldwin, keeper of that chapel, rang the bell every 7th morning. Its tone, clear, low, and resonant, traveled through the frost-heavy air like a call through the ages. It did not command, nor plead. It reminded. A reminder that warmth must also be kept within the spirit. Villagers came, slowly, bundled in cloaks, boots crunching over snow. They did not fill the pews with song or procession. They sat in silence, each near the hearth or window, holding their own thoughts close. Brother Aldwin would read not from lofty scriptures, but from quiet passages, psalms about refuge, stories of patience, parables of light blooming in darkness. His voice was soft and slow, like the shifting of branches in snow. He spoke not of fire and judgment, but of gentleness, of endurance, of kindness as warmth. His sermons were less instruction than invitation, reminders to care, to watch, to endure with love. Osric, who came with Matilda each week, often sat cross-legged on the floor near the fire pit in the chapel's center. He would listen to Brother Aldwin's voice as one might listen to the wind in the trees or the bubbling of a pot, something constant, grounding, older than he could name. But faith in Grellenford was not confined to the chapel. It echoed in the customs of every home. In the mornings, when the fire was first stirred, Matilda would murmur a brief prayer, not to saints by name, but to warmth itself. May flame rise, may hunger fade, may this day hold. When water was drawn from the frozen well, a single drop was spilled to the earth as an offering to those who had none. When bread was broken, a crust was set aside for the spirits of the departed. Some gestures were old and nameless. A sprig of rosemary hung above the door, a waxen mark traced on the lintel during the first frost, a whisper over a child's brow when sleep would not come. Whether these acts belonged to the church, the forest, or the hearth itself, no one questioned. Faith was a blanket made from many threads. On certain nights, when the snow fell so thick that the world vanished into white, Brother Aldwin walked the village with a lantern in hand. He did not knock nor call out. He simply passed by each home, pausing long enough for his light to be seen, a small flicker at the window, a promise. Osric loved those nights most. He would sit wrapped in wool at the window, waiting, and when he saw the warm circle of light glide past their cottage like a firefly in a dream, he would smile and return to sleep. That light was enough. The villagers believed in the unseen, not because they were simple, but because they had learned to live with what could not be touched: cold, wind, time. Why should faith be any different? They did not expect miracles, but they believed in quiet mercies, a storm that passed before morning, a calf born strong, a fever that faded, a loaf that stretched farther than expected. These were the blessings they knew. These were the prayers they gave thanks for. On the coldest night of each year, the chapel hosted what was called the Still Mass. No words were spoken. No sermons were read. The people came and sat in silence as the wind moaned beyond the walls. Each person brought a candle. They lit them together, and for an hour or more they simply sat, faces illuminated, breath visible, hearts quiet. It was not grief they held. It was reverence. For in winter, even the soul learns to listen. Matilda told Osric once that prayers said in snow carried farther. There's less noise to catch them, she explained, and the world is still enough to hear. He had tried it once, standing in the field behind their cottage, whispering a wish into the wind. He never told anyone what he wished for, but he always believed the snow had taken it somewhere important. Faith took many forms in Grellenford. Some kept small wooden crosses beneath their pillows. Others traced patterns into bread dough before baking. Some hung bells from their barns to ward off spirits. Others believed the ringing kept their cattle healthy. A few, like Maeve, spoke of older spirits, the kind that dwelled beneath roots and within hearth smoke, and offered their own prayers in their own ways. But none mocked. Faith was never ridiculed, not in winter, for winter reminded everyone that they were not masters of the world. They were guests, visitors in a land held fast by silence and snow, and so they lit their candles. They knelt. They hoped. One morning, after a fierce blizzard had buried half the village, the chapel bell did not ring. The path was impassable, the snow too deep even for Brother Aldwin. But just after sunrise, as the villagers opened their shutters and stared into the unbroken white, they heard something else. A chorus. Not loud, not rehearsed. But across the village, one by one, voices rose in a familiar hymn. Mothers sang in kitchens, elders hummed by fires, children joined, soft and shy. The song was not for performance. It was for the morning, for the stillness, for each other. Osric sang too, his voice cracking with youth but strong. And in that moment, the village was a chapel. Faith, it seemed, did not require stone walls or bells. Sometimes all it needed was a song in the snow. As winter wore on and the snow grew deeper with each quiet night, the world beneath it began to disappear. Paths once familiar became mysteries. Fences vanished beneath white drifts. The contours of the land, shaped by years of footfalls and wagon wheels, faded into smooth, soft hills. In Grellenford, even the earth itself seemed to slumber. Osric often stood at the edge of the yard with a walking stick, poking at the snow to find the path to the barn. What had once been a clear trail of worn grass and packed soil was now buried beneath a quilt that hid every rise and rut. He had to guess where to step, relying on memory and instinct rather than sight. Beneath that snow, the village's memory waited. Every winter, things were lost. A pail left outside before a storm, now entombed until thaw. A shovel leaned against the barn, now part of a snowbank. Even tools of trade, hammers, knives, baskets, disappeared beneath the drifts if forgotten just one night. They would be found again, in time. But until then, they belonged to the snow. And it was not just objects. The very paths between homes, the short cuts and worn corners where people crossed fields were gone. The village moved differently now. People walked the long way round, skirting the deepest drifts, creating new trails that twisted strangely through what had once been straight. Adric once remarked, "In winter, even the land forgets itself." Yet the snow did not just bury, it revealed, at least to those who knew how to look. Matilda, who had lived in the village all her life, could read the subtle signs. A slight dip in the snow might mean the location of an old well long covered. A tuft of straw poking through could mark where the chickens had once been fed. A narrow indent could be the edge of the stone wall that bordered the elderberry grove. She taught Osric to see with more than eyes, to look for shadow, texture, silence. "Snow is not blank," she said. "It is a veil, and every veil hides something." Osric grew fascinated by what lay beneath. He would dig carefully, searching for forgotten things, a broken fence post, a rusted latch, a length of old rope. Once he unearthed a carved wooden spoon that had likely fallen during last year's thaw. Its handle was worn smooth, its bowl cracked, but still, he felt as if he had uncovered a relic. There was a quiet magic to it. The idea that under the snow, the village continued to exist, just waiting. Some said that beneath the chapel, deep under the stone, there were even older things. Foundations of buildings long since gone, tools of forgotten smiths, and coins minted in kingdoms no longer named. Brother Aldwin did not deny it. "The earth remembers more than books," he once told Osric. "It keeps its own scripture." The children often imagined what else might lie hidden. They spoke of treasures lost in the last great storm, of a hunter's blade dropped and never found, of a ring slipped from a hand while gathering firewood. One tale even claimed there was a silver bell buried near the well, left from a time when a lord's carriage passed through and lost its finery in the snow. Of course, most of these were just stories, but stories have a way of becoming part of the land. There were practical concerns, too. Beneath the snow, ice could form unseen. A sudden misstep might lead to a twisted ankle, or worse. Adric always walked with a staff in winter, tapping the ground ahead of him. Some villagers marked paths with stakes wrapped in cloth so that travelers would not wander off the true way. Yet, there was beauty in the buried, too. Osric loved how the snow softened the hard lines of fences and roofs. The village looked gentle, like a painting brushed with whitewash. Even the barns, usually so rugged and tired, appeared dressed in finery. Icicles hung like chandeliers. Doorways glowed with the contrast of darkness and snowlight. And beneath it all, beneath the silence, the cold, and the slumbering earth, there was a kind of trust. Trust that what was buried would return, that paths would emerge once more, that the tools lost to frost would be found, that the land, though hidden, still held them. One afternoon, during a break in the snowfall, Osric wandered beyond the barn and followed a trail of rabbit prints through the snow. They led him to a place where the snow seemed thinner, and with his mittens, he cleared it gently. There, he found the old stepping stones that led down to the stream, now frozen and buried, but still there, still solid. He ran his fingers across the stone, feeling its chill, but also its memory. That night, he told Matilda what he had found. She smiled. "The stream will wake when it's ready. You just found its breath." That phrase stayed with him. Winter, for all its harshness, was also a season of breathing beneath. The land breathed beneath the snow. The roots held fast beneath the frost. The village endured, not just above the ground, but in all it carried beneath. Memories, forgotten tools, lost paths, and old stories. And so the people waited, for the thaw, for the return, for the unveiling of all that had been hidden, not lost, but resting. In Grellenford, winter was not only about surviving the cold. It was about trusting what lay beneath it. It did not happen all at once. There was no trumpet in the sky, no grand gesture from the heavens. But slowly, quietly, the light began to return. At first, it was only a sliver, a minute more of daylight, barely noticed, slipping shyly over the frostbitten hills. The sun, which had lingered low and brief for so long, began to rise a little higher, to linger a little longer before dipping behind the trees. The villagers of Grellenford noticed not by the clocks they did not own, but by the light upon their walls, by the way shadows stretched later in the day. It was Osric who saw it first. One morning, after breaking a crust of ice to fetch water from the well, he paused and looked up. The air had a different color. Not warmth, not yet, but a softness. The sky, instead of gray, was tinged with faint gold near the edges, like a candlelight behind thin linen. He ran back to the cottage with flushed cheeks and told Matilda, breathless, "It's brighter." She looked out the window, her face unreadable at first. Then she nodded. "Yes," she whispered, "the light returns." After that day, the changes came slowly, but steadily. Icicles that had hung for months began to thin, dripping into the packed snow below with soft, deliberate notes. The sound of water, foreign after weeks of silence, echoed like a secret being told for the first time. The snow no longer fell with the same weight. Where once it had blanketed everything in stillness, now it fell light and quick, melting before it could settle. Paths began to reappear. Footprints lingered longer. The village was beginning to breathe again. In the barn, the animals stirred differently. The cows lowed more often. The hens, who had long ceased to lay, clucked with new rhythm. One morning, Matilda found a single egg in the straw. She held it like a treasure, showing Osric with quiet reverence. "Life remembers," she said, "even after sleep." Edric checked the trees for buds, running his thick fingers over the bark. It was too early, but not impossibly so. "Another few weeks," he murmured, "if the frost doesn't come again." In Grellenford, the thaw was not met with fanfare. It was watched with careful hope, guarded joy. Winter had not yet ended. It was still present in the wind and the still frozen earth, but it had begun to loosen its grip. Each day, the villagers noticed something new. A patch of mud where snow once was. A crow cawing from a branch instead of silence. A crack in the frozen stream that whispered of water moving beneath. Osric began to leave the cottage more often, following the edge of the woods with a small spade and a satchel. He dug carefully in the shallow drifts near the southern slope, hoping to find the green of snowdrop shoots or the first shy crocus. Once, he found a patch of moss no longer stiff with frost. He touched it and felt, not warmth exactly, but softness, life. Inside, the hearth still burned, but less fiercely. Blankets were not needed in such numbers. The pots hung a little higher over the flames. The stew was thinner, but the mood was lighter. With the returning light came laughter. It was hesitant at first, as if unsure it would be allowed, but in the evenings over simple meals, stories were told with more color. The children played longer before dark. Someone carved a new whistle from birch and taught the younger ones a tune. Even the elders, wrapped in shawls near the fire, smiled more easily. The chapel bell rang not just as a call to prayer, but as a herald of change. Brother Aldwin began speaking of the coming spring, not as a promise, but as a path. "The thaw," he said, "is the body remembering how to move." During the next gathering at the chapel, he laid pine needles on the floor, not fresh, but not yet dry. Their scent, stirred by the steps of worshippers, filled the air with forest. The people breathed it deeply, remembering. And still, they waited. For the thaw was not without challenge. With melting snow came new cold, wetter and more biting. The paths turned to slush and ice, treacherous underfoot. Roofs, burdened for months, began to drip steadily, their beams creaking with change. Wells refilled too quickly, turning some water cloudy. The thaw was a rebirth, but birth is never without pain. Yet, no one turned back, because with each step forward, the world softened. And with softness came a kind of forgiveness. Matilda began sorting through seeds, tiny pouches wrapped in old cloth, stored since the last harvest. She did not plant, not yet, but she counted, and she smiled. Osric helped, marveling at the thought that such small dry things could become green again. One morning, a group of boys ran through the village square shouting that a fox had been seen near the edge of the woods. Not a hungry one, but sleek and curious. The forest, it seemed, was waking too. And then came the first rain. It fell lightly at first, barely enough to stir the dust. But the next day, it fell in earnest, steady and rhythmic, washing the snow from roofs, clearing the paths, turning the drifts into rivulets. The rain did not feel cold. It felt like permission. Permission to hope. Permission to move. Permission to dream again. That evening, as the rain tapped gently upon the shutters, Osric stood at the threshold of the cottage, breathing deep. The scent of thawed earth filled his lungs. Not quite spring, but the idea of it. The memory of warmth carried on the breath of a world beginning to stir. He turned to Matilda and asked, "Is it really ending?" She stepped beside him, her hand resting on his shoulder. "No," she said, "not yet." Then, after a pause, "But it's beginning to begin. When the first green came, it was shy. It did not erupt from the earth in triumph, nor paint the fields in sudden color. It crept, timid, uncertain, through cracks in the thawing ground, through mossy stones and damp hollows where the snow had finally retreated. The people of Grellenford knew how to look for it. Osric and Matilda were among the first to go searching, bundled still in cloaks but walking with lighter steps. The thaw had left the paths muddy, and the air still held a chill, but the sun had begun to warm the stones, and the earth, long sealed, was beginning to breathe again. They walked past the barn and across the southern slope, where the sun lingered longest. There, where the snow had melted down to the roots, they knelt and brushed aside wet leaves, and they found it. A shoot of wild garlic, bright and tender, pushing through the black soil. Matilda touched it gently, as one might greet a returning friend. She closed her eyes and whispered a short blessing, an old rhyme meant not for harvest, but for welcome. Then she pulled a few shoots, careful not to take too many, and wrapped them in cloth. "We eat green today," she said, and Osric grinned. The first greens of the year were not the crops from fields. They were gifts from the woods, from the edges of life. Nettles, sorrel, young chickweed, dandelion leaves sharp with flavor, and the faintest fronds of fern. These were the signs that the world was waking. The villagers called this early foraging the spring tongue, for the way the body remembered taste after months of salt and starch. A handful of nettle boiled into broth, a few shoots of garlic mashed into porridge. These were feasts, not for fullness, but for flavor. And flavor was hope. Matilda prepared their first spring broth that night. It was thin, made of boiled roots saved from the cellar, and a precious rind of smoked meat. But into it she stirred the chopped greens, and the smell that rose was green itself, alive, sharp, almost wild. When Osric tasted it, he closed his eyes. It was as if the forest had stepped into their cottage and whispered, "I remember you." Edric, stoic as ever, took his portion with quiet thanks. But even he paused after the first spoonful, letting the taste rest on his tongue longer than usual. That week, more villagers took to the woods. They walked slowly, watching the land as they had watched the sky in winter. The best gatherers were not always the strongest, but the most patient. Maib, the village wise woman, returned with baskets of young herbs, her fingers stained with damp soil. She showed the children where to find violets blooming between rocks and explained how to tap birch trees for sap. Sap, that first sweet drink of the year, was thin and clear and barely flavored. But to those who had sipped only water, it was like tasting sunlight. It was collected in clay pots tied to the trunks with twine, allowed to drip for hours, then mixed with hot stones and herbs to make a warming tonic. "Drink slowly," Mabe told Osric as she handed him a cup. "This is the tree's heart." And indeed, it felt like something sacred. With each day, the signs of life multiplied. The hens began laying again, slowly, one egg every few days, but enough to mark the turning. Lambs were born, legs wobbly, but eyes bright. The river, which had slumbered beneath ice, began to murmur. The sound of moving water returned like music after long silence. Even the birds began to return. At first, just the occasional call from a distance. Then more. Blackbirds, robins, and finches, flitting among the trees, calling to one another with songs that carried the memory of far-off, warmer lands. Children followed the birds, imitating their calls, laughing freely again. The villagers, still cautious, began to clean. Blankets were aired, tools removed from their resting places. Windows were unshuttered for longer each morning. Fires still burned, but not as fiercely, and every pot of stew now held a handful of something green. The first green changed more than diet. It changed posture, tone, mood. Matilda began to hum again while she worked. Brother Aldwin spoke more often of planting than of endurance. Even Halric, the blacksmith, reopened his forge's side window to let in the new light. Osric, ever curious, started a journal, just a few pages sewn together with twine. On each, he drew the plants he found, wrote their names as best he could, and noted where they grew. It was not a scholar's book, but a boy's map of spring. Matilda praised it with a soft hand on his shoulder and a quiet, "The world needs remembering." But not everything returned at once. Snow still lingered in shadows. Frost still crept onto windows at night. A sudden storm could yet roll down from the northern ridge and remind the village that winter was not fully gone. Even so, the villagers moved with faith, not haste. They planted no seeds yet, but they touched the earth. They built no new pens, but they cleaned the old ones. They lived not in spring, but in the promise of it. And perhaps that was enough. One evening, Osric stood barefoot on the stone threshold of their home. The stone was still cold, but not biting. He looked out at the slope where the sun was setting and saw the field mottled with green and white, the last snow lying beside the first growth. It was not a full transformation, but it was beginning. And that beginning, quiet, gentle, fragile, was more beautiful than any triumph. With green returning to the hedgerows and the air beginning to hold the memory of warmth, the village of Grellenford stirred from its winter stillness in earnest. What had once been a landscape of hush and softness began to shift beneath the feet of its people. The ground, still heavy with thaw, no longer resisted every step. It yielded, and in that yielding, the work began again. Tools, long stored and lovingly maintained through the winter, were brought out from barns and lean-tos like old friends returning to their place in the world. Hoes with worn handles, spades sharpened against stone, pruning knives passed from father to son, all were taken in hand, weighed, inspected, and made ready. There was no ceremony to this, no trumpet or call. But to those who lived by the land, the moment was sacred. Edric began early, long before the sun had properly warmed the soil. He moved with practiced care, walking the boundaries of his small field, his boots sinking into the soft ground. Beside him, Osric carried a bucket of pebbles and debris, gathering what the snow had left behind, fallen twigs, brittle stones, bits of old wood displaced by the frost. This was not yet planting. This was readying. Land must be reminded, Edric said, stooping to tug a clump of grass. It slept long. You don't rush it awake. So they walked the field, not plowing, not tilling, but simply moving, touching, noticing. The birds sang overhead, not loud, but persistently, as if coaxing the earth from its dreams. Insects, once vanished, began to hum low in the hedges. Other villagers were already at work in their own corners of land. Widow Hild, though stooped with age, tapped the handles of her garden fork and leaned into the earth with strength born from years. Her plot was small, but every inch would be planted. Her hens followed behind her, scratching at the soil, as if eager to join in the sowing. At the edge of the village, Merrick and his sons had begun shaping wooden stakes for the peas that would soon need support. They stacked them in neat bundles, bound with rope, their ends sharpened like quiet promises. No one planted yet. It was too early, the night still cold, but the work of becoming ready filled every moment. Matilda spent her afternoons sorting seeds. She laid them on the table in little cloth pouches, each carefully labeled with wax pencil and tied in colored thread. Barley, rye, broad beans, peas, carrots, onions, cabbage. Each pouch held a weight of memory, harvests past, meals shared, failures endured. She opened one at a time, pouring the contents into her palm, inspecting them with care. Any that were shriveled or mold-specked were set aside. The rest she counted aloud, the sound of numbers more a chant than calculation. Osric sat beside her, sketching the layout of their planting bed on a scrap of birch bark. Matilda traced her finger along the rows he'd drawn. "Too close," she said gently, "and the roots will quarrel." He nodded and began again. In the forge, Halric hammered out replacement tines for a broken rake. The sound of his work, sharp, rhythmic, echoed like a heartbeat through the softening village. Every tool repaired, every nail reshaped, was a step toward renewal. The work was not easy. The ground remained stubborn in places. In the mornings, a thin layer of frost still painted the furrows silver. Hands chapped anew from the cold, muscles ached with the return to movement. But there was no complaint, only the quiet murmur of labor shared. Children helped too, though their roles were smaller. They gathered early dandelions for the goats. They swept the thresholds of the barns. They carried water from the well, their buckets swinging like bells. Even the youngest felt the shift. The world was no longer only waiting. It was asking. Brother Aldwin walked from home to home, not with sermons, but with stories of planting, parables of seeds grown in stony soil, tales of vines that refused to yield until sung to daily. He spoke of how patience was the first tool of spring. "The ground," he said to Osric one afternoon, "is not a servant. It is a friend. You must tend it like a story. Begin gentle, then deeper." Osric repeated the phrase to himself later as he turned a small patch near the back of the cottage. The soil was dark and fragrant beneath the top crust. Worms curled within it, another sign, Matilda had said, that life was returning. He pressed his hands into it, not planting yet, just feeling. This was how the season turned, not in thunder or bloom, but in the small, patient rituals of readying. At night, the family sat by a quieter fire. The heat of the flames was still needed, but less fiercely. The stew simmered with more herbs now, more flavor. There was more to speak of. Plans, charts, guesses about the weather. The long sleep of winter had loosened its hold on them, and the world outside no longer felt so far away. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, Osric walked out to the field alone. The sky burned gold and lavender. The air smelled of damp grass and ash. He looked at the rows they had marked earlier, now smoothed by wind but still visible. He knelt, not to plant, not yet, but to place his hand upon the earth and say, without words, "We are ready." It came quietly, as most ghosts do. One morning, when all the signs had pointed towards spring, when snowdrops bowed their white heads beneath hedgerows and the fields had begun to breathe green again, the frost returned. Not fierce, not biting, but soft. A lacework of ice traced the windows. The ground, newly softened by days of sun, had stiffened once more beneath a silver sheen. It was the final frost. The villagers of Grellenford recognized it at once. Not with surprise, but with a kind of gentle respect. They had seen it before, this last visitation of the cold, the winter's parting breath. It was as though the season, having watched from the shadows, wished for one final glance. Edric rose early, stepped outside, and stood for a long moment on the threshold. He held his breath, watching the frost shimmer on the bare branches. Then he nodded once, as if in quiet agreement with something unspoken. Matilda stirred the embers with more care that morning. The fire burned a little hotter, the porridge pot hung a little lower. She whispered a small prayer, not for protection, but for passage. "Let it pass kindly," she said, "and let it pass for good." In the barn, Osric found the water buckets rimmed with ice once more. The animals, unsettled by the sudden return of cold, shifted and lowed. He moved among them with practiced hands, laying down extra straw, breaking the thin crust of ice for drinking. He spoke to them softly, reminding them, and perhaps himself, that it would not last. Throughout the village, others made similar gestures. Doors were left closed a little longer. Wool shawls reappeared on shoulders. Boots were lined again with straw. But no one paused their work. No one undid what spring had begun. They moved forward, simply with an added layer, as one might walk with a memory at their side. There was something beautiful in the frost's return. The sun, climbing slowly into the sky, turned every blade of grass into glass. The trees glittered with tiny jewels. Even the fence posts, rough with age, wore crowns of silver. It was a final gift, perhaps, a last show of winter's quiet grandeur before it faded. Osric watched from the hill above the cottage, a blanket over his shoulders, breath rising in steady clouds. He did not fear the frost. He had lived it, endured it, learned from it. This was not the frost of midwinter, the hunger, the silence. This was a ghost, gentle in its parting. Still, there was care to be taken. Matilda covered the seed pots they had prepared near the hearth. Edric checked the barn roof again, wary of dripping ice. Mabe distributed tiny sachets of dried herbs to be placed near young sprouts, a blend said to guard against the last cold. Whether it worked or not, none questioned. It was tradition, and tradition, in its way, was a form of protection. In the chapel, Brother Aldwin lit candles of dark blue wax, ones reserved for moments of transition. He spoke briefly to those who gathered, saying, "The frost returns, not to hinder us, but to remind us of what we've passed through. Let it bless us with memory, not fear." That evening, as the sun lowered and the silver on the grass began to melt into dew, the villagers gathered one last time to mark the farewell of winter. There was no great feast, for stores were still thin and planting had only begun. But there was bread, flat rounds cooked on the hearthstone, spread with the first wild garlic butter. There was broth, warm and fragrant with new herbs, and there was song. Not of joy nor mourning, but of release. Osric sat beside the fire with his neighbors, watching as Mabe placed a single pine bough into the flames. It cracked and hissed, its scent rising like incense. This, too, was an old tradition, the burning of a winter branch, a symbol of the season's end. Each person, in turn, added something small, a scrap of cloth, a withered sprig of holly, a bundle of dried straw. Not to banish the cold, but to thank it, to honor it for what it had taught. For winter was not enemy, it was teacher. It had taught them to endure. to share, to hope with empty bowls and cold fingers, to find warmth not only in fire, but in presence. And now, as it departed, they sent it with respect. Later, as the stars emerged in the crisp sky, Osric stepped out once more. The frost was already fading, melting from the fences, the trees, the edges of the field. He walked to where the snow had last gathered, now reduced to a few soft, glistening mounds. He knelt, placed a hand to the ground. It was damp. Cold, yes, but alive. He smiled, stood, and turned back toward the cottage. Inside, the fire still burned, but not for fear. It burned now for warmth, for cooking, for laughter. Behind him, winter retreated. Ahead, the soil waited. And in between stood the people of Grellenford, ready, grateful, and still carrying the memory of snow like a song in their bones. When the frost had finally gone, and the earth no longer groaned beneath the weight of cold, the people of Grellenford emerged fully into spring. It was not a sudden celebration, not a festival of horns and banners. It was quieter than that, deeper, like a breath held all winter, finally exhaled. The planting began. Edric was the first to turn the soil, walking the rows with his spade in hand, each step slow, purposeful. Osric followed behind, spreading ash and compost from the winter's hearth, a mix of soot, bone, and vegetable ends saved through the cold months. The earth accepted it hungrily, its dark skin drinking in the warmth of the sun. Now it begins again, Edric said, not to Osric, but to the land. Other families followed. Fields that had lain still and silent for months now stirred beneath boot and tool. Rakes scraped through the thawed soil. Furrows were carved, straight and clean. Seeds were pressed into place by gloved fingers or bare hands, depending on the task. And as the sun rose higher in the sky, the fields filled with motion. Not hurried, but steady. Not frantic, but hopeful. Matilda planted with precision. Her fingers, though reddened from the chill still clinging to the breeze, moved like dancers across the soil. She whispered to the seeds, as was her habit, old blessings learned from her mother. Grow deep, grow true. Drink sun, drink dew. Sleep gently till the sky turns blue. Osric listened, then echoed the words softly as he pressed broad bean seeds into the loam. That first day of planting, they worked from dawn to dusk. The hours passed quickly in the rhythm of the work, the lift of the hoe, the soft press of seed, the covering sweep of soil. Meals were taken in the field, shared between furrows, fingers muddy and hearts light. Even the elders, who could no longer bend to the ground, came and sat upon stumps or stone walls, offering guidance, telling stories of seasons past. The entire village moved with one mind, as if every hand, every back, every tool was part of a single living thing, growing, reaching, remembering. There was laughter, too. Children ran with seed bags almost too large for them, squealing as hens chased them curiously. Young men competed in digging contests, boasting about the straightness of their rows. Someone whistled a planting tune, and soon others joined in, voices rising like birdsong over the awakening land. The sun shone longer now. Its warmth sank into the fields, into faces turned skyward, into the very bones of the cottages. No longer a stranger, the sun had become a companion again. Each night, as they returned to their homes, muscles aching and hands blistered, there was satisfaction. Not in what had been achieved, but in what had begun. The first green rows appeared days later. At first, they were little more than threads, thin blades of barley peeking from the earth, tiny fists of sprouting peas pushing upward. Osric ran to Matilda the morning he saw them, breathless and grinning. She followed him to the garden bed, knelt, and placed her hand beside the new shoots. "Well," she said gently, "they've heard us." Brother Aldwin spoke of the planting in his next sermon, not as a miracle, but as a covenant. "We give to the earth," he said, "and the earth remembers. It may test us, it may wait, but it remembers." He blessed the tools brought to the chapel steps, rakes, hoes, watering pots, not with oil or incense, but with words and touch, and the oldest symbol of all, a small cross drawn in ash. It was enough, and the work continued. New fences were mended, water channels reopened, seedlings were thinned, vines were trained along trellises made from old bed frames and willow poles. The compost heaps were turned with care. Chickens wandered more freely now, scratching between rows, watched over by Matilda's ever-watchful eye. Every evening, Osric recorded what they had planted in his little bark-bound journal: onions near the south hedge, cabbage in the long bed by the barn, herbs in the raised boxes by the kitchen door. He marked the days of sprouting with tiny stars. The pages filled quickly. And still, the earth gave more. Wildflowers opened in the meadows. Bees returned, buzzing around the first blossoms. The river sang louder now, breaking free of its ice, rushing with new purpose. The animals grew restless with the energy of the season. Lambs leaping, cows lowing, the rooster crowing long before sunrise. Hope was no longer whispered. It was lived. One evening, just as the sky turned a deep plum, Matilda and Osric sat on the stone steps of their cottage, watching the light fade across their little plot. The rows were still uneven in places. Some seeds had not yet sprouted, but the soil was warm beneath their feet, and the air carried the scent of herbs, smoke, and life. "You've done well," Matilda said, her voice quiet. "We all have," Osric replied, then paused. "And the earth, too," he added. She nodded, looking out at the fields, the soft curve of the hill, the darkening edge of the forest. "Yes," she said, almost to herself, "the earth always does her part." And as the stars blinked awake above them, the village rested, not in idleness, but in the peace of purpose. The cold was gone, the seeds were planted, the green had returned, and in that soft, moonlit spring, Grellenford lived again. By the time the fields of Grellenford had fully greened, when the hens laid daily and the river ran fast and sure, the long cold had become a memory. Yet, like the frost that lingered in the shade of stone walls, that memory held fast. It lived not in sorrow or fear, but in reverence. For the cold, harsh as it was, had been a teacher, and its lessons, learned slowly by hand and heart, would be carried long after the snow had vanished from the hills. Osric walked the village paths now barefoot, the soil warm beneath his toes, the scent of grass rising with each step. Around him, life sang. Children ran in the meadows. Smoke rose gently from chimneys, not out of necessity, but for cooking, for gathering, for comfort. The doors of cottages stood open. Laughter echoed freely between gardens and fences. And yet, even in warmth, he remembered the stillness. He remembered the hush of frost on window panes, the weight of blankets shared by firelight, the scent of stew that stretched further than expected. He remembered the sound of his mother whispering blessings over embers, the rhythm of his father's axe splitting wood in dawn's hush, the way the barn pulsed with heat from huddled animals. Most of all, he remembered the togetherness. For winter had pressed them close, had removed distraction, had made of every small kindness something radiant. A shared cup, a song sung in shadow, a coal passed hand to hand like a holy thing. It was in those moments that Osric had learned the true wealth of the village. Not grain, not goods, but grace. The people of Grellenford had no statues to commemorate the season. No banner stitched, no hymn newly written. Their tribute was simpler. They remembered. Each spring, on the first full moon after planting, the village gathered, not in mourning of winter, but in gratitude. They brought nothing but words. No food, no fire, just stories. Elders spoke of winters past, of blizzards overcome, of illnesses endured, of miracles found in small things. Children listened with wide eyes, often seated at the feet of the same men and women who had taught them how to bind a bundle of kindling or warm a stone for bed. These stories were not for fear. They were roots that anchored the village in memory. Osric shared his own that year. Standing shyly beside the chapel steps, he read from his bark-bound journal, notes of seeds, of snow, of the first green. He read of the bird he had saved in the barn, of the flame that never died in their hearth, of the whisper his mother had spoken when frost kissed the fields for the last time. When he finished, the silence that followed was not empty. It was full. Brother Aldwin closed the gathering with a quiet phrase. "The cold is not our enemy, it is our measure." And so the villagers nodded, not in fear, not in defiance, but in understanding. Winter had asked much of them. It always did. It had asked for patience, for care, for courage, not born of heroism, but of habit. It had asked them to endure not just with strength, but with gentleness, to hold each other, to remember what mattered. And now, with summer rising on the horizon, they carried those lessons forward. Matilda returned to spinning, but now beside the open door, letting in the scent of mint and sun-warmed grass. Edric tended the fields with a lighter step, his brow less furrowed. Maeve dried herbs not in urgency, but in preparation, her fingers steady as always. And Osric, still growing, still wondering, now knew that seasons were not simply weather. They were chapters in a longer story. And winter, quiet, stern, beautiful, was a chapter that would always remain. In the nights that followed, as the air turned sweet and soft, Osric sometimes lay awake and listened, not for the howling wind, but for the quiet within himself. He had grown in that cold, not in height alone, but in spirit. He had learned to wait, to work, to wonder. One such night, beneath a sky thick with stars, he asked his mother, "Do you miss the winter?" Matilda considered the question, her hands resting in her lap. "I don't miss the cold," she said slowly, "but I miss what it brought us. The quiet, the closeness, the reminder." She looked toward the hearth, now cold but ready. "It shows us who we are." Osric nodded. He understood. The cold would come again. Perhaps not as cruel, perhaps crueler. But now he would meet it not as a boy afraid of the dark, but as one who had walked through it, hand in hand with firelight, with memory, with love. And so the village of Grellenford moved into the warmth, bearing the lessons of the long cold like a blessing whispered by snow. No longer shivering, no longer silent, but stronger. And beneath the summer sun, beneath the laughter and light, the seed of winter's wisdom lay hidden, quiet, deep, eternal, waiting, just as it always had.